Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly discussion series that's hosted by the Chaldean Cultural Center in collaboration with U of M, Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. I'm your host, We Am Naimou, and our guest today is Angela Naimou. Welcome, Angela.
Thank you. Hello, Yam.
And if you notice the similarities in our last name, except for the I, yes, we are related. Angela is my niece, but we have been friends since we met. So I'm very happy that she's here, and we have similarities in regards to enjoying literature, books, and such. But Angela is an associate professor at Clemson University, where she teaches literature and post-colonial studies. She edits Humanity Journal, a multidisciplinary and international journal of human rights, humanitarianism, and development. She's the author of Salvage Works, U.S. and Caribbean Literatures Amid the Debris of Legal Personhood. So, Angela, you were born in the United States in Michigan. So tell us a little bit about your upbringing and what led you to academia, to your life in academia.
Yeah, thank you. My upbringing helped bring me to a life in academia in a circuitous way. I would say that I grew up listening to language. We all are maybe listening to language growing up, but for me, I think I was very attuned to the power and the creativity that comes um, through language and in language. So growing up with so many people in the house, including for a long time, what I was kind of astonished by was, first of all, that language became a way for people to understand themselves, also to just put art into life with a song, with a line of poetry, maybe while they're cooking or something inadvertently, but also that it was how we understood ourselves and each other. So I could see that in language and across languages, people would draw on language as a material for forming new relationships, for generating feelings of love, for kindness, trust, friendship, but also, conflict, violence, the kind of misreading that come through language, because it is a very complicated material in our everyday life. So I think from a very young age, I was in a loud and amazing household, and I listened. And that was very important to me. And what I also saw was that through language, I could see social life, our society, the ideas that circulate in our society that make the world we live in. All of that was helping actually to shape language, and language, the words we used, also helped shape and organize that society. So I think that relationship was very important to me. And so you had, the kind of the way that it is in art, but that it's also as necessary to everyday life as bread. It's how we think too. And so,
Well, when you were talking, it reminded me of when you were younger, you were always using all of your senses at the same time. So you would be baking cookies and reading at the same time. I'm not exaggerating this, okay? And I mean, at least now we have Audible, so it's like we have both of our hands, and we can listen as like I cook. But for you would be literally baking and holding a book, so you're very crafty in that way. And whether there was music, and yes, there was the chaos in the background, but we could see you were so absorbed in literature. And because of that, because I knew your love for literature, when I started writing, you were my first editor. I trusted you, even though you laughed at my writing initially. you,
I laugh.
you laugh all the time, though, as you can tell. You have a very really down to earth and very lovable personality, and I know that you tried not to, but you did give me very constructive feedback. And from that time, the reason I trusted you with that is because I saw you were always, there were books all around, so you were going into the lives of others, and to exactly what you said, you were using language to understand others, but it wasn't limited to books. That's what I'm saying, is by you being in that kitchen, by you having all those sounds, you were aware of your environment as well as how it's being portrayed through books. And this led, I mean, I'd like to know a little bit. You've written this book, Salvage Work, if you can see it. And this was your first book? Was it your first book? Yes. So I'm interested, what led you to decide on writing this book? Because I feel like some of the things that you're sharing right now has to do with the subject matter, and what is the book about?
Yeah, that's great. So this book originally, it was I worked towards a dissertation as part of my graduate study, and then I revised the dissertation and really reworked it into this book. And what I would say is, I went to graduate school partly because maybe this is what books did when I was a kid as well. There was this kind of sustained space where I could think about language, but also about the people in my life, also about our world. And school is not the only place for that. Thinking is everywhere, of course, it's all in us. But for me, it was really special and rare. And I think it's rare in life to have spaces that are really devoted to a shared attempt to understand things together, to ask questions with other people and to think, and just that space felt important and valuable. And I went to upstate New York just 3 weeks before September 11th. So that's where I started grad school at Cornell. I think that event that also brought in so much of the history of the United States, of its relationship to the world, of very complex social and political questions, really generated, the core ideas of this book. So it's written for mostly graduate students and scholars. It's a work of scholarship. But I try to tell a story that is kind of simple, I think. The story is really about how law creates our idea of what a person is. So a person is not just a human being. We use it that way, but it also means something, a category. It's an entity that is recognized by the law. So what we find, if you think about the history of law, is actually the history of classifying people according to categories that change what they can do in life, that prohibit them from certain things in life, that enable them to do other things in life. People's worlds are transformed and changed because their legal status is under a certain category. And we see that, growing up, in immigrant communities understand this so well, and how completely artificial it is. And I would say unjust. The system is not a nice, benign way, a friendly way to just order things. No, it's really changed people's lives, and it has to do with the play of power and rights. And so what I ended up doing is learning. I chose as some of my teachers a lot of contemporary writers and artists, and I found in them some of the most powerful and honest and complicated understandings of how law can create these categories and try to constrain and manage people's lives, whether they are enslaved person, free Black person, as part of our history of the Americas and its relationship to slavery, or a colonized subject, or I found out like sailors, they were understood as a different kind of person under law, so they could be forced to work. That led me to look at something like a Supreme Court case from 1897, and reading it and thinking, well, how did this happen that if you were a sailor, you could be understood as someone who could be forced to work? You're a different kind of person when you're a sailor. And so what I saw is that you also get the history of race and empire and migration. And that, learning about that, how do writers and artists take up such a complicated, difficult thing, human problem? How do they respond? And how do they open up new ways of imagining our lives, our possibilities, different ways than the way we have now? Because this is not the only way, it's not inevitable. And so that idea that we have to be honest with the difficulty of the past, it helps shape the present, but also that there are ways that we are free to call for other kinds of futures. And for me, just even thinking about what I learned in the process of writing this book. So it's not about Middle Eastern writers and artists. That's a book I'm working on now. But
okay. So I'll ask you about that one next.
I can't ask too much right now. But just to say, and I'm sorry to go on too long, please let me know.
No, please. Let's move on. I want to say that this book was winner of the 2016 ASAP Book Prize from the Association of the Study of the Arts, too. So it has won an award, and it's very interesting subject. I see here you talk about the masks of personhood. I love how you describe that, because it's true. We do sometimes we're not even aware of these masks that we wear when we go out, how we are inside the homes, how we are when we enter certain buildings versus other buildings. So it applies, I think, just about everybody. If they see the masks that we have to feel, we put on just automatically. We don't even think of it this way, but the way you describe it here, it just kind of helps you think how there's this tendency that we hide our instinctual self because of fear or something that we have been almost trained to become. And seeing sometimes what's happening in the world, you see that the frustrations of being locked in or putting on these masks, unfortunately, reveal themselves in very harmful ways sometimes.
That's so, I really thank you for saying it this way. There's a poet, Paul Dunbar, a Black poet, who said, "We wear the mask." And I think it gets at exactly what you're saying too. And this led to so many discoveries. I'm not a trained lawyer, so I had to kind of study all of this. But what I found is that so much of legal history is really about our everyday lives. The original meaning of person was a reference to a literal mask that actors would wear to amplify their voice. And I thought it was interesting that it went from a literal mask to help like actors be heard by the audience to somebody who has a voice that the law will hear, which is why you can have a corporation be a person too. It's so strange. How does a corporation have a voice that can be heard? And then we have humans who are struggling to be heard. And so everything you just said is really important. And also it means that, people can have different relationships to that mask. For example, there's a scholar named Ian Eni Lopez, and he wrote a book called White by Law. And it's really about these series of legal cases in the late 19th century and all the way up to almost the middle of the 20th century, where people from the Middle East were coming to the US and saying, "I want to be classified as a white person so that I could become a citizen," because the US had these Asian exclusion acts, and they had, of course, a very legally racist system against non-white. So the category of white has no biological standing. It was actually decided in these courts, and it turns out that the courts did not have any consistent way to determine who was white and who was not white. So you had a man from Syria, and if you read the transcript, it'll say they noted that his skin was the color of walnut, which was not in his favor to be considered white, but he was Christian, so that was in his favor to be considered white. And each courtroom had to come up with an answer. It was totally inconsistent, but it meant the difference between whether somebody would become a citizen or be ineligible. And then, of course, it shaped, I think, the way that people across racial and ethnic categories end up understanding themselves as part of a shared life or not, you know?
So, Angela, given what you just said, I'm curious. We've talked before, like the community, about us being placed or misplaced as whites, which technically we don't feel we fit into that category. And sometimes that has, in different times, though, that has worked against us, which I think this whole entire labeling thing is just really does not benefit anybody. But in more recent years and what's going on, so even then when you're Middle Easterner, but then labeled white Christian, and that doesn't work for your favor as well nowadays. But your current project that you're working on, does the things that you're discussing right now, is that material that we will find in your new book? Can you tell us about the new book a little bit? Because this is new information for me. To hear about it. And it sounds like it applies to a lot of, we are from the Middle East, and we have the largest concentrated community here in Michigan. We have the largest population of Chaldeans in the world, and the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States. So this topic is very important for us. So I'd love to hear about the project that you're working on right now.
Well, thanks. I'll try to be very brief because it's still sort of in the early thinking stages and planning stages. But my hope is that I can really study and write about migration by thinking about the people who actually endure these different kinds of migrations and displacements. And sometimes the migration stories come through and they're kind of individual stories about how one person was able to make it through the system of immigration, or what happened to that person, or maybe it's only one group. And so what I think is happening, so many people who have these experiences of migration or displacement, or whether they're internally displaced or they've crossed an international border, is that actually they are thinking about what is actually shared by all the people whose freedom to move or to stay in kind of a sense of peace and justice where they are, that our mobility, our freedom to move or to stay, is really being managed by what is an international global system, border system. And that border system is wreaking enormous devastation in the world. And so how is that happening? How do people understand and survive it? How can we think and not just give all the power up to the system of border control, but actually question it, and think about that, and look to people who are organizing for different ways to welcome each other. This is a question I have. And so what I'm thinking is that there are many writers in Palestine and Iraq, especially. I'm doing a lot of reading and learning, and just the very, very amazing, writers, contemporary writers and artists who are really thinking about these problems from Palestine, from Iraq, from Iran too, and then thinking about this global system. And so it will take me sort of to the questions about international law, but it's also questions about how people who are moving or how immigrant communities are not closed communities, actually, but that they're making these connections to everyone who is being managed by the border systems. And, so, one connection for us is, I know we went together to Detroit, but, to have the ICE raids that were, unfairly separating people from their families, taking people, throwing them in mandatory detention. It was really awful. There's a longer history of that happening. And then it happened to many, Iraqi American residents in Michigan and elsewhere. And you can't, to understand it means looking at the connections to others. So Angela Davis has said, all struggles are connected. And many people are saying that now. They're saying these different struggles for living freely and with justice and in a society that actually encourages a good life for everyone. Well, all of those struggles are actually linked. And I want to see, how are they linked? How are people understanding those links? And how are they making those links? Because they have to understand how that global border system has been working, partly to divide people, partly to understand these different categories. So you can do family sponsorship if you're from here, or you can do this if you're from here, or you don't have a claim to asylum during the pandemic because we're worried for the pandemic. Well, look around us. There is no real concern for the health and well-being of people that requires anybody to be kept on the Mexico side of the US-Mexico border, for example. So just understanding that these things are connected. And I think writers and artists can just speak with so much honesty. They're not advancing a policy position.
Well, I'm glad you just used that word, the word honesty, because I was going to say that I think what Middle Easterners feel, or of people of Middle Eastern background, especially women, there is this feeling that sometimes there are certain stories that are, for political purposes, are more focused on. And so depending on the political climate, then women who we are already have difficulty voicing themselves from the region that they're from kind of re-experience that here, but in a different way in the Western world. And so the point is honesty, so that we can see different perspectives. And I had forgotten that we did go when ICE, that was it was very difficult to watch and see how these families that had been here for a very long time, who really didn't, they it was like for nonviolent crimes or something that was like from 30 years ago. And we discussed that, how sometimes resources are placed in the wrong area because there are real criminals out there that we could focus on that are really bringing harm to people, rather than some of the things that had occurred in the past. So I'm looking forward for that new book, and then we'll have you back on, because I'm sure in the process of you writing it, you will come across many important things that you could share with us as you have for this book. So you teach literature to undergraduates. What do you enjoy? What is that experience like? And what have you learned from it? I also know that over the years, you have been learning the Arabic language. And have you done that because it applies to, your work, or what has that experience been like? And how do you bring that into the teaching?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I will say, my relationship to language obviously was difficult and complicated and rich. But one of the important things maybe to mention is that I spoke to my grandmother's in Aramaic at home, but that Arabic was not spoken to me, and that my parents didn't see me as needing to learn Arabic, or why would you want to learn Arabic? And there's so much also difficulty and maybe sometimes a traumatic response, to someone's own home or native language, that I think it came through while I was growing up, but around me were everybody speaking Arabic. And so for me, this was a long time coming. I'm in my 40s now, and usually people said, "Oh, don't try to learn; it's too difficult." So I thought, and maybe this goes into some other
They
idea.
didn't know who they were talking to.
Yeah. Well, you know what? They were right. It's hard. But yes, I think so. For me, I'm trying to learn, and I have a wonderful conversation partner when I can't study in an intensive way somewhere. I speak to a conversation partner. Her name is Varti, and she's a Syrian refugee who's living in Armenia, and she is my teacher right now. And so that's been wonderful and difficult, but very, very meaningful. And I also know that learning the language, you're in a very specific relationship to it. I never sound like a native speaker. People will laugh at me when I was trying to speak in Fusha, a simple sentence, and because of the different registers of Arabic. But in many ways, that's true to my own situation. Like, I was born in the US, but my household were people who had newly arrived, including you, Riam, and all of my aunts and uncles, my dad's family. So, or most of them, everybody who could come to the US, and then my grandparents. So in many ways, I have to just be okay with not being, with sort of sitting at the side, and again, maybe listening, learning, asking questions, and just sort of discovering in that way. So that part has been great, and I can do that with my students. That's one of my favorite parts. That's really important to me as a teacher. So I can give you just two quick examples. One was, I teach a literature of the Middle East and North Africa course, and of course, this is like a new area, relatively new area for me, but it's an important one for me. So going along with my contemporary US, Black, Latino, and writers of the diaspora, that's sort of what I had studied first, and I'm bringing it together with the literatures of the Middle East and North Africa. And so the last week of classes, we were reading poems by Mahmoud Darwish, and it's this beautiful collection in Arabic and English, so they're side by side, called A Butterfly's Burden, and it's a beautiful translation. Anyway, I didn't know what they were going to think, and then some of the students contacted me before class. They said, "Can we please read outside? Because it's beautiful outside. And also, can we just read? Can we just listen to each other?" Because it turned out they were in so much love with Mahmoud Darwish's poetry in English that they started writing their own poems.
Oh,
They
wow.
were listening to each other, and it was just really lovely. And then maybe more seriously, another thing that happened this semester was a Black writer, Jessamine Ward. She's a very amazing writer. She wrote a short essay in Vanity Fair about losing her husband during the COVID pandemic. And I taught this essay with her memoir about losing many people in her life, many men in her life. And there was a student who was very quiet most of the semester until that day. And it took a lot, but she finally said something. And then she had a space of trust that I'm very grateful. She found that she could trust this space, and she shared that she had lost her parent just a few months before. And then, something happened where it's like we have a collective care for each other. And that is, along with learning, they're not separate. So many of our biggest problems are social problems, they're about humanity. They're not just technical problems to solve through a technical solution. And so understanding that is really part of literature and the humanities. And I think it takes place and it shines through in teaching, and that was one moment where it was, and I was very grateful.
Yeah,
to just be part of that.
someone, yeah, that really cares about her students. And I think, when you were telling me how they felt around you in that safe space, again, it takes me back to when I asked you to read my material, because I felt like there was that safe space of you caring. It wasn't about just the writing, but you caring about the person's growth, what they're trying to do. So that was from like very long time ago, and it's obviously still, it's still. I'm not gonna say years or anything like that. But it was a long time ago, and it has obviously grown given how you've expanded with the circle and encompassing all these people and that need to be heard in that way. And I think especially for immigrants, they go a lot by feelings, because we come in our case, we come from a very oppressed region. And when you're oppressed and you are not able to verbalize your feelings, and maybe not even your thoughts, because you block everything. But what you go by is feelings. You feel if something feels dangerous, it feels good, if it feels so. There's a quietness sometimes that happens that creates being withdrawn because of the fact that you live in such an oppressive region. That I know for myself, as it was only when I came to the Western world, and thank God for my teachers. From it was in Schweitzer Elementary, the first, I forgot what grade I started, I think in fifth grade. And from the beginning, she said, "Hey, I really like the story. Can you go and read it in a conference?" And at that time, I'm a kid, I'm just responding to my teacher. But over the years, when I look back, I see what she did. She was giving me a voice. She was allowing for me to express my story, seeing that I needed to do that. And it still took very, very long time. So when you say about certain people and how it depends on how you grew up, and your teachers, the mentors, the people around you who open that up and say, "We want to hear this." And what they'll find sometimes, I know, like with Chaldeans, because they're fairly new as immigrants, sometimes the way they express something can come out to can feel very it can seem aggressive or negative, but that's because of their inability in the past to exercise the right to communicate. So imagine, trying to be a writer when you've never written anything, unless you're just prodigy and you just know how to write. So that expression comes out in a different, maybe anger or a prejudice or something, because there's so much built in that. I think the healing process starts with listening with teachers like yourself who are creating that safe space. I loved when you say that, like the safe space will create the geniuses in us, is what I believe.
And can I just add to that, because you said it so beautifully, and it's really important, because you were one of my earliest teachers. You did that, and you and a few relatives that are so dear and close to me forever and ever told me stories. You were creative, but also you shared, well, here's what happened in our family. Here's something that still stays with me that happened in my childhood. Or, just that, being open and taking the time to have our voices together and to listen and to feel that actually this is an important relationship that you have opened as an older person when I was a child was so, it really changed, really, I think the way I understand being in the world. And that was really important. And sometimes the pressures you're talking about, people can suppress things. And also they can be very focused on the practical, like, hey, we're struggling to make things, we've got to do this. Let's stick to the practical. Let's focus on work. Let's do this or that. For what I really believe, and sometimes they say, I'm lost in the clouds. But I thought, no, I think this art, life, sharing, hearing, listening, really just that connection is core in our lives. That is life. It should be in our everyday life. And whenever you make this space, it doesn't have to be through a profession. Whenever anybody makes that space for others, you are generating something important in the world, and nurturing that. So thank you,
Well,
for being
that
one
was
of
very
those dears.
beautiful. Actually, I think I was going to ask for last words, but I think those were the most beautiful last words, that we don't have to be in a classroom. We don't have to be in any position. We could be as a parent and exchanging, listening, because, it's important even to listen to our children, and for the children to understand, and from that to learn how to listen to the parent, because there has to be that exchange, and it's a very important exchange. And you're right, maybe I have seen what people such as yourself have done, and sometimes we forget that we also are playing a role as immigrants. I gave a talk the other day, and I said, what do we offer? America has offered so much for us. It created a haven for us that we no longer really exist in the region that is supposed to be our native land. That was, but we brought along our energy and our stories, and we're able to share them. But aside from allowing us to share it, we are also mirrors for the Western world, for the Americans, who there are some things that might be happening that we could be mirrors by sharing our stories, so that people can have a different perspective. So, Angela, thank you so much. Thank you for your wisdom and for doing the work that you do, and for continuing to do work. I know that you're going to just continue to excel, but in the process, raise up people along with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful day.